Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Clare Crew.
You're listening to the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Clare Crew, and in this episode, I'm chatting to Pedagogical Consultant Lisa Burman about Playful Literacy. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thanks, Claire. Finally, we've made it.
I know we've been talking about this for probably 6, maybe even 12 months.
Yes, I think so, but oh well, better late than never.
Absolutely. So I thought that before we speak to the topic of playful literacy, it'd be really helpful to hear a bit more about your background, because right now you support educators and school leaders, but that is also where your journey began.
Yeah, definitely. I actually often say my first love is early childhood. So I began as an early childhood educator, and I worked mostly in the early years of primary school. So I had a reception or foundation class or year one class for probably 10 years. And then I moved into school leadership. So I was a deputy and a principal for a little while. During that time too, I actually did some early intervention work. So I have a Bachelor of Special Education. So, there's a whole lot of stuff that was going on in my career as a teacher. And in fact, I still think of myself as a teacher. It's this fancy word, a pedagogical consultant, but really I'm still a teacher. I just work more with the adults these days, with the teachers, and hopefully impact the lives of children a whole lot more that way. I'm based in Adelaide. So after, I don't know, maybe it was 15 years or so, I haven't actually added that up, I got the opportunity to go to the US and work as a literacy consultant in New York. So I packed myself up for a year of adventure and ended up staying 10. I'm not sure my family have quite forgiven me for that yet. So I worked out of New York City for 10 years as a literacy and an early childhood consultant, working with schools in their public education system, but also Jewish schools and a couple of Catholic schools there. And in that time, I started building up some working, because I'd come home for a holiday and my friends who were principals would say, oh, could you come and talk to my staff about this? Or could you run a workshop about this? And kind of my consulting business grew from there. And now, yes, as I said, I'm working in all sectors around Australia. I've just actually come back from doing some work in Canada as well, and we're really excited to be branching out onto the online world. I've got 3 different e-courses available at the moment. So even though I do definitely see myself still as a teacher, it's just working a whole lot more with the grown-ups and the children directly these days.
And one of those online courses that you have is actually called Playful Literacy. It's something I did last year and I loved it. And in that course, you talk about 3 foundations of literacy, being symbolic play, oral language, and mark making. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit to each of those, starting with symbolic play.
Sure. Yeah, that was the first e-course that I developed based on some face-to-face workshops that I've been doing, because it was the thing that most people were interested in. And so, yeah, symbolic play. I think it's so underestimated, the role that pretend play or symbolic play has on developing literacy. I think one of the big fallacies is that we seem to think, when we think of literacy, we think about reading, writing in terms of learning the alphabet and going straight to those print-based literacies. But before that, our brains need to be wired up in so many other ways. And of course, you've got that great perspective, Claire, on how our bodies need to be wired up, physically. But in terms of symbolic or pretend play, that's when we develop symbolic functioning. So when children are pretending that a stone is, it could be a plane, a truck, an apple that they're pretending to eat, an aeroplane, when they're pretending that that stone stands for something else, it's the beginnings of symbolic functioning, that something can symbolize another thing. And so unless we've got that really strong symbolic functioning, embedded in us, then it's actually really quite difficult to then go to the much more abstract symbolism of the alphabetic system. And so I really believe really strongly that we've got to ensure that children have so many rich, playful experiences, starting with lots of pretend play where they get to use loose parts and different play props and pretend, because of this strong link with symbolic functioning and being able to understand later that that squirrely thing on a page actually represents a few different sounds.
Yeah, it really does make sense, doesn't it? And it did when I did your course, but it's a connection that often isn't really made. And a lot of us as educators see play as being foundational to all of that later, more formal academic learning, but not necessarily directly benefiting literacy specifically.
Yeah, I remember when I first learnt about it, it kind of blew my mind, and in a way that was like, oh, of course, that makes so much sense. But it's something that has got lost, I think, in the literacy debates over the years, particularly when we're thinking about children, in kindy and prior to school and in their early years of schooling. The focus just seems to be so much on those abstract forms of symbolic functioning, the alphabet, and not so much about those things that are really the grounding force, in my view, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So we might move on to oral language. One of my favourite quotes is from James Britton. I think it's one of your faves too. Reading and writing float on a sea of talk, because kind of what you hinted at before is that we really just expect that once children enter the classroom environment, they're going to be ready to start learning how to read and learning how to write. But if they haven't got those great foundations in oral language, really we're setting them up for failure.
Oh, for sure. I knew exactly which quote you were going to say as soon as you said his name. It is one of my favourites. And I think there's a lot of research that makes that link. So we can find research that says, vocabulary is really important to reading comprehension. But I actually like to kind of dig into that and try to uncover why and how it helps us. So we know that children who have a wider vocabulary and stronger oral language, so it's not just about vocabulary, it's about, understanding the rhythms and patterns of language. Those children have a better chance of being successful with the print-based literacies. And, one of the reasons, one example of that comes to mind for me is when we're thinking of children as readers of print, that so many children struggle with being able to predict at that word level because they haven't got the vocabulary around whatever it is that they're reading about. So, for example, let's say there's two children and they're both reading a book all about fishing, and one child has, never been fishing and thinks that fish comes out of the freezer like fish fingers, and another child goes fishing every couple of weeks with their grandparents and has got a rich background knowledge and obviously a rich vocabulary around fishing. They're not going to be able to access the same book about fishing in the same way. The child who has the vocabulary, the oral language and the background knowledge about fishing is going to be able to read and understand that text so much easier. So that's just one example what comes to mind around oral language, but it's a huge topic. It's kind of like I don't know where to start.
I know. I guess for a parent listening, for example, with younger children who aren't yet school age, do you have any ideas or suggestions or tips for how they can, aside from just speaking to their children lots, how they actually can foster that oral language development?
Yeah, I think, things like playing with them and alongside them and thinking about the kinds of words that we're using. In the Playful Literacy e-course, we talk about tier 1, 2 and 3 words. But for example, if we're playing with a child and it's a, cafe or restaurant play, you might take the role play and say something like, oh, I'm really hungry. That's a great way to build some language, but we can stretch that even more by starting to say, oh, I'm really hungry. I'm so famished, so we can stretch the vocabulary that way in a really natural, authentic way that's not about learning words out of context, but this is just normal in their play. And I think the other big thing is reading to your children. If that's the one thing that we can do, the one gift we can give our children is to read to them and enjoy reading, have fun with books and read lots together, and not just fiction, read lots of information text together as well.
Yeah, I agree so much with that. And I think as well for educators, particularly once they're at that school level, I think it's really important to quite actively carve out some time for children to actually speak to each other, because so often it's the teacher doing the speaking. And I'm noticing a bit of a trend in classrooms at the moment too, myself, but also a few people have gotten in touch with me to share their concerns that at eating times in the classroom, the big screen goes on and a TV episode gets watched. And that for me is a really lost opportunity, not just for very mindfully eating, but also for having those casual conversations with their peers.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And again, I predicted exactly what you were going to say when you started that, because I'm really concerned about that too. You know, on lots of levels, like you said, mindfully eating, but being, enjoying your food. I guess I'm really an advocate for slow education, like slow learning, slow eating, like the slow food movement. And, to be able to enjoy the social aspect of gathering around, sharing food, even if it's not family style food, but to be in that social context, I think it is a huge wasted opportunity for kids to be watching a screen, and such a wasted opportunity for language development and for conversation and for relationship and connections to happen. And, in my view, kids get enough screen time at other places. So I'm not really sure that providing another screen time is really our best decision there as educators.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the children who, I guess, miss out the most are those who perhaps don't have those rich and engaging conversations at home. So then, they come along to school, a place where ideally they are getting that exposure and they are able to build up their oral vocabulary, but then those opportunities are somewhat missing.
Yeah, and to go back to around your question or your point around children not having enough opportunities to talk themselves, that's so true, isn't it? Because, our brain needs practice time. So the only way to practice and develop listening and speaking is to listen and speak and to engage in that oral language and lots of talk but meaningful, purposeful talk. And when I'm talking about meaningful and purposeful learning, it's for the learner. So sometimes I reckon we fall into a bit of a trap as teachers. Oh yeah, it's really purposeful, but we've set the purpose. The kids might not find any purpose or meaning in it. And that's why I think that rich play, the context provides such a meaningful and purposeful experience for kids. They will be interacting and conversing in verbal and non-verbal ways. And it's not just about our agenda on top of them all the time. So that idea of making sure we're providing enough opportunities for kids to be talking is really important.
Yeah, and they give us the clues, don't they? They always give us the clues. If we find, for example, that they're constantly talking when we don't want them to be, that might be a clue right there that they need more opportunities to do so.
That's right. Or get up and move or do something that, they tell us pretty loud and clear if we're not meeting their needs. Well, at the same time, there are some kids that I think, learn pretty quickly to be compliant, what I call pretend learners. And, I think I might have been a little bit like this at school, actually, where I let things wash over me and not necessarily get really involved. And, so I worry just as much for those kids who are telling us that we're not meeting their needs. I mean, we can respond to that, but I probably am just as concerned about those children who are pretend learning and sitting there looking like they're engaging, but they've just learnt the game of school that I sit here and I be quiet and no one's going to ask me to do anything. And if I don't have to talk or say anything, then maybe I don't even have to think and get involved. So I reckon we've got to be on the real lookout for those kids who might only half be with us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's where sometimes I have conversations with families and say, well, actually, while it's not ideal that your child's behaving in this way in the classroom, it means that they're calling out for their needs to be met. The educator is being forced to sit up and take notice. Whereas sometimes, as you said, there are those children who are almost invisible in regards to their needs. And they're the ones who can fall through the cracks far too easily.
Yes, that's right. And their well-being is really getting a battering at that stage, and their concept of who they are as a learner. Yeah. I definitely think we need to be on the lookout for those kids and not let that happen.
Yeah. All right. So we'll move on now to mark making, the third foundation of literacy. What is it?
Well, we might say drawing is probably the word that is used more commonly, but the word mark making is used a lot in early childhood education, to encompass all kinds of drawing type experiences, I guess you mean. So sometimes when we think of drawing, we just think, oh, it's on a piece of paper with crayons or textures or pencils. But mark making really starts, I think, when you pick up a stick and you're drawing in the sand. I've actually just come back from spending the weekend in the remote Aboriginal communities in the APY lands in the north of South Australia. And, we were talking about how these 3-year-olds have literacy, because they're already making marks in the sand, as they do in their communities. And that is the beginnings of literacy. So mark making can begin as quite a random thing, but often it does actually represent something, whether it's a line in the sand that you've drawn with a stick and that's actually the snake, or it's a river, or it's a road, or all other kinds of mark making that might be with different kinds of media. Sometimes I think we can look at something and go, oh, that's a bit of scribble. And yes, sometimes very young children just engage in that beautiful feeling of making marks, but quite often that scribble actually represents something for children. And so in terms of literacy, that's the very beginnings of writing, making a mark that can represent something else. And that will become much more, as children grow and develop, that scribble becomes much more representational. So we can see, oh yeah, now that represents a person or a house or a tree. And then the next step would be using, obviously, once they've built their knowledge of the alphabetic system, then the next step in developing writing would be using the alphabetic system along with their mark making and drawing, to convey meaning.
And so when we see these earlier attempts at mark making, what would be an ideal way to respond to those? Because I'm guessing that there are some ways that we could respond that would be a little bit damaging to the child's self-concept.
Yeah, I kind of just tell myself, don't assume is the first thing. Don't assume that I know what it's about, but ask the child. Obviously, some children don't yet have the oral language to tell you. So in that case, I think the best thing we can do is just to marvel in it and to not necessarily go overboard with this great praise, but just to be in the moment with the child, might just be sitting quietly next to them, watching them as they're doing it. I think that our presence can actually really communicate a lot. But, instead of asking the child, what have you drawn? Maybe it's much more open, like, oh, tell me about it. Quite often I think children will surprise us because they'll, let's say it's a scribble. This has happened to me. There's a circles of scribble on a page, and tell me about this. And the child's gone, oh, racing car. And then you go, of course it's a racing car. It's going really fast around in circles. So I think being present, being with them, you don't always have to jump in and talk to them about it, is one way. Being very open in our questioning, but accept if a child isn't going to talk to you about it. And the other thing that I think we can do with young children is to kind of narrate what they're doing. So you might say, oh, I can see that you're using lots of colours there. Oh, I can see you going around in circles. Oh, I can see that you're doing this. So some noticing and naming can just help them to understand that you're there present with them in the moment too.
Lovely. Bookmaking is another thing that came up in the course, and that's something that you go into in a whole lot more detail in some of your in-person course offerings. What is bookmaking, and how can that be used as a tool for us as educators in early childhood settings?
Bookmaking is a really rich pedagogy. It's not a program that you can just pick up and go, oh, I know how to do this now and I can follow these lessons and here's the plan and here we go. I am really passionate about it because for lots of reasons. I think that it honours children as mark makers, and as communicators through mark makers, and that's the beginning of writing development. So we're not pushing kids to get into the alphabetic mark making too soon, if that's instead of pushing them to achieve more academically too fast. It also is a really strong, I call it a pedagogy of continuity, because 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds can all really actively engage in bookmaking. And we've had some great success in many preschools or kindies and primary school settings where the children are immersed in bookmaking as 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, and then moving into their primary schooling as 5 and 6-year-olds. That just continues for them. So that's another reason that I really love it. But in a nutshell, it's a way of engaging as a writer by making picture books. And picture books use illustrations and words to convey meaning. And so we ask children to use illustrations and words to convey their meaning. So, you know, in the old days, we might have said something like, oh, no, write your words first and then do your picture after, and not really valued the thinking in the illustration. But bookmaking really honours children's ability to do both. They begin by making their books through their illustration and conveying meaning that way. Because it's a picture book, it actually provides the opportunity to do some really big thinking, because it's not just one page. And for those children who have already developed a really strong connection with picture books, they can put all of that knowledge into making a book that you couldn't if it was one piece of paper. It's so complex, I kind of don't know where to start with all that. Yeah. So you're gently nudging children when the time is right to be including words as well. And the words might start with something that doesn't look like any letter of the alphabet, but the child represents that as words. And that's such a moment of celebration, because we know then they understand that words are different to pictures, but they both convey meaning. So I've actually had some great success with year 6s and 7s using bookmaking and changing the way they think that school writing is, because now they can make books and they can actually do all this illustration work as well. One of the things that I'm really fascinated about is that when you get into this pedagogy, you really see that the thinking of a writer can be done through illustration as well. So all of the ways that writers think when they're coming up with their ideas and they're drafting and they're revising and editing that, we can do all of that through illustration. So we're actually really stretching and honouring and valuing the intellect of the child, because we're saying you can be a little bit like Nick Bland and make your books as well. And we value all of the illustration. We know that there's lots of big thinking that happens there.
Yeah, I'm doing one of your bookmaking courses tomorrow, actually, and I'm very excited to learn more, because I feel like I got a really nice taster through the Playful Literacy e-course, and now I really want to dive in more into that different way of doing things.
Well, I'm sure Marilyn and Katie, who will be facilitating tomorrow, will probably explain it even better than me, and you will have more time to get into it. So I can't wait to hear what you think of it after the mini course, though.
Another thing that came up in the e-course, which you do see at a lot of childcare and kindy sites, is the story tables. What's the philosophy behind those?
Well, I think they bring the best of the read alouds and the connection to picture books and symbolic play together. So it's a wonderful context for developing oral language. So when it's a really familiar book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, let's say, children can play and revisit that story many, many, many times. We know that wires up the brain for language, the opportunity to practice and revisit. And very quickly, we all know children can very quickly join in the refrain, but he was still hungry. So they're developing their oral language, they're developing their understanding about how the grammar of language works, if you like. And I was talking with a teacher about this just yesterday. I was saying, when we talk about the grammar, we're not saying that children can say this is a noun or a verb. We're talking about that they can hear how English should sound. And the best way I know for children to start developing that is to engage with lots of rich, beautiful literature and language experiences, and story tables offer a perfect context for that.
Just had a light bulb moment there. Oh my goodness, there are so many kids who struggle with grammar, especially middle and upper primary. And yeah, it's just like they need to go back to basics and do more of the talking and engaging in a more fun way as well.
Yeah. And singing and rhymes and some of those things that perhaps have been taken over by an academic agenda, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it still has a presence in a lot of kindergartens and junior primary classes, but even 20 or so years ago, I think you would have noticed that those things dropped off in middle and upper primary. And so even more so today. So it's a bit sad, isn't it? Because some children, by the time they move into year 3, they've grasped, things like syllables and rhyme. And then it all of a sudden becomes more abstract. Whereas for others, they still need more time to hear that and really embed those understandings first.
That's right. And just imagine for a child who's learning English, how much more complex that is. So yeah, I think it goes back to what you were saying about the opportunities for talk and lots of opportunities for rich, beautiful literature and singing and enjoying language and not trying to, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost filter down that or water down the experience.
So, Lisa, I'm wondering where we can find more of you online.
Oh, so I have a website that will be redeveloped this year, I hope. So if you're going to look at it now, you could even check in again later in the year and hopefully you'll see a much more, not only beautiful, but a website that might reflect our values more. But that's my name, lisaburman.com.au. If anyone is interested in the online courses, that's through lisaburman.thinkific.com. Probably if you put it into a search engine, you would find it. And we have a lot of face-to-face learning opportunities in Adelaide, and we're trying our best to get out to country areas in South Australia and interstate as well. It's just the demand's pretty high, and there's only 7 days in a week.
Yes, I hear you. And it's hard.
Oh, sorry. And
oh, no, you go.
Oh, Sorry, Claire. And I just thought, the other place, if people like Facebook, there's my Facebook page as well. Again, Lisa Burman Consulting in Pedagogical Growth, I think is the full title. But I know that many educators really like to engage in a bit of professional reading online. So my Facebook page might be one of those places too.
And I highly recommend your newsletter list too, because you do send things only out to subscribers. Like, what was that one recently? 10 tips to de-institutionalize your setting. Is that what it was called?
Yes, yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Not forgotten about the article, forgotten about, on the website, on the homepage, you can sign up for a mailing list. And we do use that to advertise any of our face-to-face, but, every month I try to send at least one resource or an article that's written by me or one of my team or an educator that I know. One of the ones that we're getting lots of feedback about actually is what you could say if you're asked, why don't you use spelling lists or spelling tests? So I'm trying to write a few of those, or what you could say if you're asked, kind of tips, and that seems to be going over really well with a lot of educators.
And if you're a teacher and your mind is now buzzing going, why shouldn't I be using spelling tests and spelling lists, then there's another course that you might need to check out.
I didn't do that on purpose, I promise.
I got to say though, I still quite like your website. I mean, a revamp is always nice, but, it's easy to navigate. It looks nice. And the ethos of what you and your team members do is very, very clear. You're not kind of like looking around trying to find out who are these people? What's this all about? It's very succinct as to what your values are.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't feel so bad that I haven't updated it then.
There's some pretty bad ones in education, isn't there? So before we say goodbye, do you have any parting words, I guess, about how we can honour children and their literacy development?
Oh, wow. The thing that I've been actually pondering about this morning, probably because of my experience recently of coming back from the APY lands, is that I think we need to find the joy again and just enjoy being with children, enjoy having fun reading and singing and playing together. So find the joy again.
Oh, goosebumps. That's lovely, Lisa. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks a lot, Claire.
So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Thriving Children podcast. Until next time, be kind to yourself.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit thrivingchildren.com.au.